The man who kept the gates closed. The stadium did not welcome people. It loomed. Concrete ribs stained by decades of acid rain and neglect curved against a bruised charcoal sky. From the rim, floodlights perched like watchful, unblinking eyes, though they hadn't tasted electricity in years. Steel plating, thick, industrial and jagged at the welds, sealed the lower concourses. Above the barricades, coils of razor wire glinted in the dying afternoon light, a crown of thorns for a monument to a dead world. What had once held 50,000 screaming fans now housed nearly 4,000 survivors, packed into the guts of the structure. It was something between a city and a slaughterhouse. People called it sanctuary. Cage never did. To him, it was a machine, and machines required maintenance. He stood at the intake gate, his hands hooked casually into a heavy leather belt that sagged under the weight of a sidearm. His posture was relaxed, a deliberate looseness that usually made men break into a cold sweat. It was the stillness of a predator that had already decided it wasn't hungry yet. The guards flanking him were rigid, their rifles held in a low-ready position, their faces masked by the anonymity of riot gear and grime. Cage didn't need to bark orders. His presence was the frequency they tuned their nerves to. 5 years of the collapse had carved authority into him deeper than the scars crisscrossing his ribs. He'd learned early that confidence, real, bone-deep confidence, was a more effective currency than ammunition. The line outside the gate stretched down the cracked boulevard, a serpentine ribbon of human misery. Dust clung to salt-stained boots and tattered hems. The people out there stared at the stadium with a naked, feral hunger, as if the concrete jaws might open and swallow them whole, and they'd thank it for the mercy of the dark. Cage let them simmer. He let the heat of the sun and the weight of their own desperation do the heavy lifting. Only when the shadows began to stretch toward the ruins of the downtown skyline did he lift his chin. The guards snapped into motion. The hydraulic hiss of the outer gate echoed like a pained intake of breath. "Next," Cage said. His voice was a low rasp, like stones grinding together in deep water. The woman who stepped forward didn't beg. That was the first thing that tripped the sensors in his brain. She didn't have the frantic, wide-eyed twitch of the long-term drifter. She was young, early 20s perhaps, but the softness of youth had been burned away, leaving behind something lean and tempered. Her shoulders were squared, her spine a straight line of defiance. She looked at the stadium, then shifted her gaze to him, weighing the man against the fortress and appearing unimpressed by both. "Interesting. Name," Cage said. "Stacia." No hesitation, no tremor. He looked her over slowly. He didn't rush it, and he didn't pretend he wasn't looking. His gaze travelled from her heavy, mud-caked boots up the line of her legs, clad in rugged denim that had been patched and repatched. He lingered on the curve of her hips, the way her utility jacket cinched at a narrow waist, and finally settled on her face. Her skin was smudged with soot and oil, her nose peeling from a brutal sunburn, but her eyes were a startling, piercing green. They were sharp enough to draw blood. She noticed the inspection. Instead of shrinking, she leaned into it, a mocking tilt to her head. "You always stare this hard, or am I special enough for a private showing?" Behind him, a couple of guards stiffened, their knuckles whitening on their grips. Cage didn't move. He felt a slow, dark heat stir in his gut, not just lust, but the spark of a challenge. It had been a long time since someone had dared to bait him. Cage let a slow, predatory smile pull at the corner of his mouth. "Careful, Stacia. First impressions are the only currency you have left. Don't spend it all on being clever." "Honesty is better than currency," she shot back, her voice honey-thick but laced with vinegar. "And honestly, you look like a man who enjoys being watched. You like the way the light hits those shoulders. You like knowing everyone out there is wondering what it takes to make you move." A low chuckle erupted from one of the veterans in the guard detail. Cage didn't silence him. Instead, he stepped forward, erasing the distance between them until he was deep inside her personal space. He was a head taller, his shadow swallowing her whole. Most people recoiled from the scent of him, the metallic tang of gun oil, the musk of leather, and the cold scent of the concrete he called home. Stacia didn't move. If anything, she breathed him in. Her nostrils flared, and for a second the air between them felt pressurized, thick with the kind of tension that preceded either a fight or something far more intimate. What I enjoy, Cage murmured, his voice dropping to a velvet growl near her ear, is efficiency. I like things that work. I like people who know their place. Start talking before I decide your place is back on the boulevard. Her lips curved into something sharp, almost a snarl. South corridor, 3 months on the road. We hit a scavenger nest near the ruins of the mall, lost 12 people getting here. The rest are behind me. Congratulations, Cage said dryly, straightening up. You're ahead of the average. Most groups don't make it past the bypass. Her jaw tightened, a small muscle jumping in her cheek. I'm not average. Scan me. He motioned with 2 fingers. She stepped into the sensory arch without being told, her arms raised. The machine hummed, a series of ultraviolet lights tracing the contours of her body, highlighting the lean muscle of her arms and the rise and fall of her chest. Green. Clear. Cage's gaze didn't stay on the monitor. It slid past her, focusing on the ragged group clustered 20 yards back. 6 adults. 1 child. They were too still, too quiet. In the wasteland, silence was never peace. It was a symptom. He straightened his posture, the casualness evaporating. Hold. Stacia spun around, following his gaze. They're with me. Are they? Cage asked mildly, his eyes narrowing as he studied a man in the back of the group who was leaning heavily against a rusted barricade. Yes. That wasn't the question, Stacia. I asked if they're with you, or if they're just hanging on to your coattails while they rot. She stepped back toward him, irritation flaring into a visible heat. You let me in, you let them in. That was the deal I made with myself when I saw this hellhole on the horizon. Cage's smile widened just enough to be condescending. He reached out, his gloved fingers tracing the line of her jaw, a touch that was part threat, part caress. She flinched, but only for a heartbeat before leaning into his hand with a defiant glare. That's not how this works, sweetheart, he whispered. Her eyes flashed. Don't call me that. Then don't talk like you own the place. I own the air you're breathing right now. I own the ground you're standing on. If I decide you're a liability, you don't exist. She stepped closer, her chest nearly brushing the tactical vest over his ribs. She had to tilt her head back to meet his stare, but she didn't lose an inch of ground. Funny. You look like a man who forgot this used to be a stadium for the people, not a throne for a tyrant. A ripple of genuine unease ran through the guards. No one talked to Cage like that. No one lived to do it twice. Cage didn't move. He liked the heat coming off her. It was vibrant. It was alive. In a world of walking ghosts, she was a bonfire. You want to know why this place is still standing? He asked, his voice deathly calm. Because I don't let pretty speeches and soft hearts override reality. I don't trade in maybe, I trade in is and isn't. Reality, she scoffed, her breath ghosting over his skin. You mean control. You're addicted to the power of the no. I'm addicted to survival. She laughed, a short, sharp sound that echoed off the concrete. That what you call it when you play God with a gate? You're just a gatekeeper, Cage, a glorified bouncer in a suit of armor. He leaned in, his lips inches from hers. He could see the gold flecks in her irises. He could smell the salt on her skin. I call it triage, he said. And right now, your people are bleeding out. You're just too blinded by your own hero complex to see it. Her expression faltered, just a fraction. The fire in her eyes flickered, replaced by a cold, sudden dread. What are you talking about? Cage didn't answer her. He turned and snapped his fingers, the sound sharp as a gunshot. Bring the kid closer, now. The woman holding the child hesitated, fear etched deep into the hollows of her face. She looked at Stacia, then at the rifles leveled at her chest. Now, Cage said, his voice turning to steel. The woman shuffled forward. Cage crouched slightly, his eyes locking onto the child's face. The boy was maybe 6. His skin was the color of old parchment, pale, sweaty, and translucent. His pupils were blown wide, swallowing the irises, and a faint rhythmic tremor was working its way through his small hands. Then Cage looked at the man beside the woman. He noted the stiffness in the man's gait, the way he favored his left side. There was a grayish tinge under his skin, and his jaw was clenched so hard the tendons in his neck stood out like cables. Cage straightened, his face an unreadable mask. He looked back at Stacia. You didn't notice, he said. It wasn't a question. She bristled, her hands curling into fists. Notice what? They're exhausted. They've been walking for weeks on half rations. Stage 1, Cage replied. Low-grade fever. Motor hesitation. Elevated aggression suppressed by sheer physical exhaustion. They aren't tired, Stacia. They're incubating. Her breath caught. A flash of denial crossed her face, followed by a desperate, stabbing anger. You're wrong. You're looking for excuses to keep them out. I'm not. You scanned me. I'm clean. I scanned you, he agreed, his voice dropping into a dangerously low register. And you're a prize, but they are a death sentence. I scan them, the alarm goes off, and my guards are required by protocol to put a bullet in their heads right where they stand. Is that what you want? Her face flushed a deep, angry crimson. You're condemning them without proof. You're a coward hiding behind a badge. I'm refusing to gamble 4,000 lives on your optimism. This isn't a democracy, and it isn't a charity. It's a life raft, and the raft is full. She stepped back as if he'd struck her. They're not infected. They're my family. Cage's voice dropped until it was almost a whisper meant only for her. One of them is. Maybe two. It's early enough that they don't know yet. The hunger hasn't started, but it's late enough that if I let them in, I lose this stadium in 48 hours. I've seen it happen to better places than this. You don't know that for sure. I built this place, he said flatly, his eyes cold and hard as flint. I know exactly how it dies. It dies because someone like you thinks their heart is bigger than the virus. Behind them, the woman holding the child began to sob, a thin, wavering sound that cut through the heavy air. Stacia spun on Cage, her body vibrating with fury. You arrogant, cold-blooded bastard. That made him smile again. It was a dark, jagged thing. There she is, he murmured. I was wondering when the teeth would finally come out. I like the teeth, Stacia. They suit you. You hide behind these rules because you're afraid, she snapped, stepping into him again, her finger jabbing into the center of his chest. Afraid to be wrong, afraid to let someone else have a say. You're not a leader. You're a jailer. Control, Cage said, straightening to his full height, his voice now carrying across the entire intake area, is the only reason any of the 4,000 people inside those walls are still breathing. You think I enjoy the weight of this? You think I like being the monster at the door? I think you love it, she spat. I think you enjoy deciding who deserves to live and who gets left for the crows. The accusation landed with a heavy thud. For the first time, Cage's expression shifted. Not into anger, but into something sharper, a flicker of something ancient and predatory. He reached out, his hand moving so fast she didn't have time to blink, and gripped her chin, forcing her to look up at him. You want to see a monster? He asked softly. Stay tuned. He let go of her and stepped back, turning to his head of security. Take her. What? Stacia gasped, twisting as two guards grabbed her by the upper arms. You can't let me go. Detainment, Cage said, his voice flat and official. For incitement, obstruction, and potential biological hazard protocols. Take her to the East Block. Isolated. You're proving my point, she shouted, kicking out as they began to drag her toward the inner reinforced doors. You're just a tyrant in a concrete castle. You're pathetic, Cage. You hear me? Pathetic. Cage didn't look at her. He didn't watch her struggle. He turned his gaze to the group still waiting outside the bars. The sick man, the crying woman, the dying child. Seal the gate, he ordered. Sir? The guard hesitated. The others? The gate is closed, Cage said, his eyes like ice. Apply the deterrent if they don't move back within 60 seconds. The heavy metal doors began to groan on their tracks. The sound was a scream of iron against iron, drowning out the pleas from the boulevard. When they slammed shut, the boom echoed through the concrete tunnels like a gunshot, final and absolute. Cage stood in the sudden ringing silence of the intake bay. He could feel the eyes of his men on his back, some with fear, some with a grim, sickening respect. He didn't care about either. He walked away, his boots rhythmic against the floor, but his mind was still back at the gate. He could still feel the phantom heat of Stacia's skin against his hand. The holding corridor smelled of ancient oil, sweat, and damp concrete. It was the smell of the old world's basement. Stacia was shoved into a reinforced locker room that had been converted into a temporary cell. The floor was cold tile, the walls were thick brick, and the door was a heavy grate of steel bars. They slammed shut with a finality that made her teeth ache. She spun around, her chest heaving, her hair falling out of its practical knot in wild, dark strands. She grabbed the bars, the cold metal biting into her palms. "Cage, you coward, come back here!" She waited, her breath coming in ragged gasps. 5 minutes. 10. The silence of the stadium was heavy, a physical weight pressing down on her. Then the sound of boots. Slow. Deliberate. Cage appeared in the dim light of the doorway. He had shed his tactical vest, wearing only a black thermal shirt that stretched across his chest and shoulders. He looked less like a soldier now, and more like something primal that had been invited indoors. She laughed harshly, the sound cracking in the small space. "Come to admire your handiwork? Or did you just miss the sound of someone telling you the truth?" "I came to see if you'd cooled off," he said, leaning against the opposite wall, his arms crossed. "Clearly I overestimated your self-control." "You threw me in a cage for trying to save people," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of rage and exhaustion. "You left a child out there to die." "I threw you in a cage because you're dangerous, Stacia. You have a way of making people believe in things that don't exist anymore, like hope or mercy." Her eyes narrowed, her grip tightening on the bars. "And that scares you? That someone might actually have a soul left?" Cage stepped closer, moving into the pool of amber light spilling from the corridor. His face was a landscape of hard angles and shadows. "What scares me is how easily you were willing to risk 4,000 lives for the sake of your own conscience. You wanted to feel like a hero, so you were willing to let a plague through the front door. That's not soul, Stacia. That's ego." "I saved them from the road," she whispered. "You delayed the inevitable. The road always wins in the end. I'd just make sure it doesn't win here." He walked right up to the bars. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. The air between them was electric again, charged with a strange dark chemistry that neither of them seemed able to switch off. Stacia didn't pull away. She leaned her forehead against the cool steel, looking up at him through her lashes. "You don't get to act like you're better than us. You're just the one holding the keys. That doesn't make you a god. It just makes you a lucky bastard with a gun." "I don't think I'm better," Cage said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate rasp. He reached through the bars, his fingers tangling in her loose hair, pulling her head back just enough to force her eyes to stay locked on his. "I just know better. There's a difference." She searched his face, her anger warring with something else, something uncomfortably close to recognition. She saw the exhaustion in the corners of his eyes, the heavy burden of every no he'd ever had to say. "You're wrong about me," she said, her voice barely audible. "I'm not just some girl with a hero complex." Cage let his thumb brush against the pulse point in her neck. It was racing, a frantic drumming beneath the skin. He watched her lips part, saw the way her gaze dropped to his mouth for a fraction of a second. "No," he said softly, his voice a dangerous promise. "I think you're exactly the kind of trouble that gets inside eventually. The kind that starts fires just to see what burns." He let go of her abruptly, the loss of contact feeling like a physical blow. He turned and walked away, his boots echoing down the long, hollow corridor. Behind him, Stacia gripped the bars until her knuckles turned white. She was furious, she was shaken, and she was already certain of one thing. The man who ran this stadium was going to be her ruin. And Cage, walking back toward the command center, felt a familiar cold ache in his chest. For the first time in 5 years, he wasn't thinking about the gates, the rations, or the virus. He was thinking about the girl in the cage and wondering which one of them would be the first to break. Chapter 2. The Cost of Open Gates. The stadium did not sleep. It was a living thing, a behemoth of iron and ego that pulsed with a low-frequency anxiety. Generators throbbed beneath the concrete like a second heart, sending a constant grounding hum through the souls of everyone inside. In the silence of the night, that hum was the only thing that felt stable. Voices echoed through the circular corridors at all hours, arguments that flared over a misplaced pair of boots, laughter that went too loud too fast as a mask for terror, and the occasional sharp crying that stopped so abruptly it was more haunting than the noise itself. Life packed too tightly always made noise. It was the sound of friction, of too many souls rubbing against one another in a space built for spectators, not inhabitants. Cage lay awake on the narrow cot in his private quarters. It was a Spartan room, a former coach's office with cinder-block walls and no windows. He lay with his hands folded behind his head, eyes fixed on a hairline fracture in the ceiling tiles. He hadn't gone down to the holding block since sunrise. That in itself annoyed him. Cage prided himself on his routine. He was a man of cold, calculated movements, but for the first time in 5 years, his focus felt fractured. He could still see her face behind the bars. He could see the way her fury hadn't dissipated into the usual broken spirit lethargy he saw in most detainees. Instead, Stacia had sharpened. She had taken her anger and forged it into something colder, something that felt like a blade being drawn slowly across a whetstone. Most people broke in stages. Fear first, then a frantic, messy anger, then the inevitable, pathetic pleading. Stacia had skipped straight to defiance. That made her dangerous. It made her a variable he couldn't solve with a simple equation of rations versus security. It also, much to his frustration, made her memorable. He found himself remembering the way the golden light of the corridor had caught the sweat on her neck, and the way she hadn't blinked when he'd threatened her life. Cage exhaled a long, ragged breath through his nose and swung his legs over the side of the cot. He didn't indulge sleeplessness. In this world, if you weren't dreaming, you were dying. He dressed quickly, his movements muscle memory efficient, boots laced tight enough to feel like an extension of his legs, a heavy canvas jacket shrugged over his shoulders. The small cracked mirror on the wall caught his reflection. He saw the dark stubble of 3 days' growth and a faint purplish bruise blooming along his jaw where a guard's elbow had clipped him during a scuffle near the East Concourse earlier that day, a fight over a dropped ration card. The rules were chafing. He'd felt it for weeks now, a subtle shift in the atmosphere, like the drop in pressure before a hurricane. Little fractures in obedience were appearing everywhere. People were forgetting the smell of the dead on the wind outside. They were forgetting the sight of the city skyline, glowing orange from fires that no one was coming to put out. They were starting to think the walls were the problem, rather than the only thing keeping the problem at bay. He stepped into the corridor, the heavy door clicking shut behind him, and headed toward the command center. Stacia learned quickly that the holding cells of the stadium were not designed to break the body. There were no racks, no whips, no cinematic displays of cruelty. Cage was too smart for that. They were meant to wait people out. It was a psychological siege, no screams, no dramatics, just the oppressive weight of cold concrete, thin blankets that smelled of lye, and measured meals slid through a slot in the door at unpredictable intervals. Time stretched thin and sharp. A wire slicing at a person's patience until they were willing to trade their dignity just for a change in scenery. She sat on the narrow metal bench with her back against the wall, her knees drawn up to her chest. She listened. The stadium sounded different from inside a cell. Everything was muffled and distorted, filtered through layers of rebar and brick. It sounded like a world wrapped in wet cotton and left to rot. She replayed the intake at the gate over and over in her mind, a movie she couldn't stop watching. The kid's translucent, waxy skin. The man's stiff, robotic gait. Her stomach twisted into a hard, cold knot. She hadn't seen it at the time, or rather she hadn't wanted to see it. She had been so focused on the victory of reaching the gates, so consumed by the need to be the savior of her small, broken flock, that she had ignored the rot in their midst. Cage had seen it in seconds. That didn't make him right about his tyranny, but it made him right about the infection. And that realization made her situation infinitely worse. It meant she wasn't just a political prisoner. She was a fool who had tried to hand a lit match to a man standing in a pool of gasoline. A guard stopped outside her cell, the heels of his boots clicking on the tile. He was older, his face a map of deep lines and old regrets. "You comfortable?" he asked. It wasn't a taunt. It sounded genuinely curious. Stacia didn't look up. "Living the dream. The decor is a bit minimalist, but the service is top-notch." The guard didn't laugh. He looked up and down the corridor, then lowered his voice, leaning slightly against the bars. "People are talking, girl." "People always talk," she said, her voice flat. "It's the only thing that's free in this place. Not like this." That got her attention. She lowered her legs and leaned forward, her eyes catching the dim light. "About what?" "About you. About what happened at the gate." Stacia barked a short, harsh laugh. Lucky me, I'm the latest tabloid scandal in the apocalypse. You stood up to him, the guard said, his voice dropping even lower, a mere rasp of air. Most don't. Most just look at their shoes and hope he doesn't notice them. But they saw you. They saw a girl half his size tell him he wasn't God. Stacia stood up, her fingers curling around the cold bars. And how's that working out for me? I'm in a cage and he's still wearing the crown. The guard met her gaze, something uneasy and dangerously close to hope flickering across his face. You said what a lot of us think, that the gates don't just keep the bad out. They keep the life in. And life is getting real thin in here. He didn't wait for her to respond. He straightened his back and walked away, the sound of his boots fading into the distance. Stacia sat back down slowly, her heart drumming a frantic rhythm against her ribs. That was how it started. A whisper in a hallway. A shared glance. Resentment was a slow-acting poison, and she had accidentally provided the catalyst. Cage watched the flickering monitors in the command room, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. The black and white feeds were grainy, but they told a story he didn't like. Clusters of people were lingering too long in the concourses. Conversations stopped abruptly when a patrol passed by. There was a heaviness to the way people moved, a lethargy that wasn't born of hunger, but of bitterness. Report, Cage said, his voice cutting through the hum of the computers. Small skirmish near the South Commons, one of his lieutenants, a grim man named Miller, replied. Dock crew. They claim the calorie count on the evening mash was low. We had to use batons to clear the line. It was low, Cage said, his jaw tightening. We lost 2 hydroponic tanks to a fungal bloom last night. We're diverting water to save the rest. They don't like the math, sir. They don't have to like the math, they just have to survive it. Miller hesitated, shifting his weight. They're saying the rules are choking them, Cage. They're saying we're treating them like livestock instead of people. Cage's eyes flicked to a specific camera feed, the one showing the holding corridor. Stacia was a small, still shadow in the corner of her cell. They always say that right before everything burns, Cage said flatly. They think freedom is more important than oxygen until they start suffocating. By the 3rd day of her stay, Stacia was no longer truly alone. The guards didn't put another prisoner in with her, but the traffic past her cell changed. It wasn't just patrols anymore. People started finding excuses to walk the east corridor. A woman cleaning the floors slipped a small extra heel of bread through the bars when the guard's back was turned. A man delivering laundry murmured, "You were right about the gates," as he passed. Someone else, a teenager with eyes too old for his face, whispered, "He's not God. He's just a man." Stacia listened to all of it. She didn't try to be a leader. She didn't give speeches or rally the troops. She was smarter than that. She just asked questions. How long have the hydro tanks been failing? What happens to the people who disappear into the work details in the lower levels? When was the last time anyone actually saw the sun without a piece of razor wire in the way? She watched how fear and resentment fed each other, a self-sustaining cycle of misery. These people didn't need a savior. They needed permission to be angry. They needed to know that the man in the high tower was just as afraid as they were. The irony tasted like copper in her mouth. She was doing exactly what Cage had accused her of, lighting a fire. But looking at the hollow cheeks and the dead eyes of the people passing her cell, she couldn't bring herself to care about the risk. If the stadium was a machine, it was one that ground people into dust to keep its gears turning. Cage came to the holding block on the 4th night. He didn't bring a detail. He dismissed the guards at the end of the hall with a sharp flick of his fingers and walked down the row of cells until he stopped in front of hers. He stood there for a long time just looking at her, his silhouette tall and imposing in the dim, flickering lights. Stacia looked up slowly. She didn't stand. She stayed on her bench, her eyes meeting his with a sharp, whetted intensity. "Come to gloat?" she asked, "or did you run out of people to intimidate upstairs?" "I came to warn you," Cage replied. His voice was lower than usual, a rumble that seemed to vibrate through the bars. She laughed quietly, the sound devoid of mirth. "You already locked me up in a concrete box, Cage. What more can you do? Double lock it?" "I can make this permanent," Cage said. "I can put you in a hole so deep you'll forget what the sky looks like. Or I can make this end." Stacia's gaze flicked down to his hands. They were resting on the bars, large, steady, and covered in a map of scars and old burns. They were the hands of a man who had built things, and broken things, and didn't know how to do anything else. "You're afraid of what I'm saying to the people, aren't you?" she asked. "I'm afraid of what you're not saying," Cage countered. "You're not stupid, Stacia. You're not reckless, despite your performance at the gate. And you're not blind anymore." Something in her expression shifted. The mockery died down, replaced by a somber, heavy honesty. "You were right about them," she said quietly. "About the infection. I saw the man, the one from the back of the group, through the small window in the gate before they moved me. He turned. Fast." Cage nodded once. There was no triumph in the gesture, no "I told you so." Just a grim acknowledgement of a brutal truth. Stage 1 to Stage 3 in less than 6 hours. It was a high-load strain. If I'd let them in, we'd be clearing the east stand of corpses by morning. "That doesn't make you right about everything," she added, her voice regaining its edge. "It doesn't justify the way you run this place." "I didn't say it did." The silence that followed was thick, heavy with the weight of the things they weren't saying. Stacia stood up then, moving with a fluid feline grace until she was standing directly across from him, separated only by 2 inches of cold steel. "You enjoy being in control," she said, her voice a soft accusation. "You like being the only one who knows the truth." "Yes," Cage replied without a moment's hesitation. That startled her. She had expected a denial, a defense of his methods. "Because someone has to be," he continued, his eyes locking onto hers with a terrifying intensity. "And because every time I've hesitated in the last 5 years, someone I cared about died. I don't hesitate anymore. People live because I am cold. They live because I am the wall. And they hate me for it. But they're alive to hate me." Her eyes searched his face, looking for the monster she wanted him to be. But all she saw was a man who was profoundly tired. A man who had forgotten how to be anything other than a guardian. "You don't look like a villain," she whispered. "I'm not trying to be one. I'm just trying to keep the lights on." "Then why keep me locked up? If I'm so dangerous, why not just put a bullet in me and be done with it?" "Because you're a spark," Cage said, reaching through the bars. He didn't touch her, but his hand hovered near her face, the warmth of his skin startlingly close. "And this place is dry tundra. People are looking for a reason to burn it all down because they think the fire will be warmer than the winter. They're wrong." Her breath hitched. "You're scared." "I'm cautious." "No," she said, a small, triumphant smile playing at her lips. "You're scared I'll make them see another way. You're scared that if they stop fearing the outside, they'll stop needing you." Cage leaned closer, his voice dropping so low it was almost a caress. "I'm scared you'll make them forget what happens when the gates stay open. I'm scared you'll lead them all straight into a slaughterhouse because you think you can negotiate with the end of the world." The air between them hummed with a sudden violent tension. For a fleeting second, Stacia imagined reaching out, grabbing the front of his shirt, Mom pulling him against the bars. She wanted to bite him or kiss him. She wasn't sure which would hurt more. "You going to kill me, Cage?" she asked, her voice trembling. "No," Cage said, his gaze dropping to her mouth before snapping back to her eyes. "But I'm not letting you walk out of here either. You're too much of a liability to be free, and too much of a person to be dead." She smiled then, a slow, dangerous curve of her lips that made his blood run hot. "You can't keep me quiet forever. Walls only work if people want to stay inside them." "I can outlast you, Stacia," he agreed. "I've outlasted everything else." He turned and walked away, his shadow stretching long and dark across the concrete floor. Stacia watched him go, her pulse racing in her throat. Cocky bastard, she thought, but there was no heat in it. God help her, she understood him now. She saw the burden he carried, and she saw the way he used his own soul as armor for the stadium. And that terrified her more than the cell ever could, because understanding him was the first step toward becoming like him. The coup did not announce itself with a trumpet blast. It crept. It was a series of small, seemingly unrelated failures that added up to a catastrophe. A guard failed to show up for his midnight patrol. A shipment of medical supplies went missing from the infirmary. A heavy blast door in the north tunnel stayed unlocked for 5 minutes too long. Cage felt the shift. He tightened protocols, doubling the guards on the internal perimeter. and cutting rations even further to prepare for the coming unrest. He was preparing for a riot, a messy, disorganized explosion of civilian anger. He wasn't preparing for a professional betrayal. Someone scrawled, "Open the gates," on a prominent concourse wall in thick, dripping red paint. Beneath it, another message appeared within hours. Tyrant. Cage stood in the hallway staring at the words for a long time. He could feel the eyes of the passing survivors on him, cold, judgmental, and increasingly bold. He didn't order the perpetrator found. He knew it wouldn't matter. The idea was already out there. Scrub it, he said to Miller, and find out who's been talking to the dock crews. They're the ones with the most to lose if the power grid fluctuates. And the girl? Miller asked, his hand resting on his sidearm. Cage's jaw tightened until it ached. She stays where she is. Under no circumstances is she to have visitors. But the seeds had already been sown. The night it finally broke, it broke with a terrifying speed. It started with a single gunshot echoing through the lower concourse, a sharp metallic crack that signaled the end of the peace. Then came the shouts, the sound of glass shattering, and then the screams. Cage was in the command center when the monitors went black, one by one. Someone had cut the feeds. "Miller, get the tactical team to the east gate," Cage shouted, grabbing his rifle. "They're trying to force the intake." He moved toward the door, his mind racing through contingencies. He didn't see the fist coming until it was too late. It was a heavy, professional blow that caught him right in the temple. Pain exploded across his vision, a blinding white light that sent him staggering against the desk. He tried to raise his weapon, but hands, strong, familiar hands, grabbed him from behind, pinning his arms. "Sorry, Cage," a voice whispered in his ear. It was one of his own veterans. "But we're tired of being hungry. We're tired of the walls." "You're fools," Cage wheezed, blood beginning to coat his tongue. "Now," someone shouted from the hallway. "They didn't kill him. They couldn't bring themselves to do that, not yet." Instead, they dragged him down the familiar, twisting corridors, his boots scraping uselessly against the concrete. They headed toward the one place where he had no power. Toward holding. Stacia heard the chaos long before she saw it. The stadium was screaming. Boots thundered overhead, the sound of heavy metal doors being slammed open or shut. She stood by her bars, her heart in her throat, watching the end of the corridor. A body slammed against the bars of the cell across from hers, the impact shaking the entire row. Then Cage was shoved into the cell. He hit the floor hard, blood smeared across his mouth, his black thermal shirt torn at the shoulder. He looked human for the first time, disheveled, bleeding, and defeated. Stacia surged to her feet, her hands gripping the bars so hard her knuckles ached. "What did you do?" she demanded of the men outside, the guards who were now locking Cage's door. A man she recognized from the laundry detail, the one who had whispered to her just days ago, looked at her. He sneered, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "What you started, girl. We're opening the gates. We're going to let people in." "You can't," she shouted. "Not with the infection still out there." The man didn't answer. He turned and ran back towards the noise of the riot, leaving the two of them alone in the dim, flickering light of the holding block. The door to the corridor slammed shut. Silence crashed down, heavy and suffocating. Stacia turned slowly to face the cell across from hers. Cage was pushing himself up from the floor. He wiped a streak of blood from his lip with the back of his hand and leaned his head against the concrete wall. He let out a short, incredulous laugh, a sound that was more of a jagged cough. "Well," he said hoarsely, his eyes finding hers in the dark, "this is a new perspective." Stacia's chest tightened, a strange, sharp pain blossoming behind her ribs. "I didn't want this, Cage. I didn't want a coup." "I know," Cage replied, his voice devoid of anger. It was almost gentle, which was far more terrifying. "That's the problem with sparks, Stacia. You don't get to choose which way the wind blows the fire." Outside the cell, the stadium roared, the sound of 4,000 people unraveling the only safety they had ever known. Metal groaned, glass shattered, and in the distance, the first siren began to wail. Between the bars, two people stood on opposite sides of a disaster they'd both helped create. Neither of them looked away. The man who kept the gates closed and the woman who wanted them open were now both trapped in the same cage, watching the world they knew burn to the ground. "So," Stacia whispered, her voice trembling, "what do we do now?" Cage looked at the locked door, then back at her. A dark, determined light began to kindle in his eyes. "Now," he said, "we see if you're as good at surviving as you are at talking." Chapter 3. What freedom cost? The first thing Cage noticed when he clawed his way back to consciousness was the smell. It wasn't the metallic copper tang of blood, though there was plenty of that drying onto his own skin, remnants of the beating that had finally sent him into the blackness of a forced sleep the night before. This was different. It was rot. It clung to the humid air of the holding block, faint but unmistakable, threaded through the concrete corridors, like a warning that had arrived too late to be heeded. It was the scent of organic decay, sweat, mildew, and human waste left too long in dark, unventilated places. The stadium had always smelled like too many people in too small a space, a cocktail of unwashed bodies and recycled air. But this was the smell of a system in failure. This was neglect. He wondered, with a sickening jolt of alarm, how long he had been out for the rot to settle in so deeply. His head throbbed in time with his pulse. Each heartbeat sent a jagged spike of pain, ricocheting behind his eyes, making the dim light of the corridor feel like needles. He lay still for a long moment, staring at the underside of the metal bench, cataloguing his damage with the detached, clinical efficiency he'd honed over 5 years of violence. Left cheek swollen, likely a hairline fracture, lip split and puffy, ribs screaming with every shallow breath. One definitely cracked, possibly two. His right wrist was a raw ring of fire where the cuffs had bitten deep during his struggle. Still alive. The thought wasn't comforting. In this world, being alive was often just a stay of execution. He opened his eyes fully. The cell ceiling stared back at him, familiar cracks running through the reinforced concrete like a map of failures. He'd overseen the retrofitting of these rooms himself. He knew exactly how much pressure those bars could take, exactly how long a man could last in here before the silence began to speak. He'd built these cages to hold the dangerous, the infected, and the dissident. Now they held only him. A humorless, dry laugh rasped out of his chest, and he immediately hissed as his ribs punished him for the movement. Well, he muttered, his voice sounding like it had been dragged over broken glass. That's poetic. Footsteps echoed from the far end of the corridor. Cage's ears pricked. He knew the sounds of the stadium better than any man alive. These weren't the steps of his guards. Guards moved with a rhythmic, heavy-booted discipline, the sound of order. These steps were sloppy. They were too fast, eager, and uneven. A man stopped in front of the cell. Cage didn't need to look up to recognize him. Rowan. He'd been one of the loudest voices among the dock crews, a man who possessed the kind of dangerous charisma that flourished in shadows. He was the sort of man who mistook the volume of his voice for the strength of his leadership. Rowan grinned, his teeth appearing too white in his grimy face. He leaned against the bars, looking down at Cage with a sickening sense of triumph. "Look at you," Rowan said, his voice dripping with mock pity. "The great Cage. Hard to believe you ran this place 48 hours ago. You look like something the scavengers wouldn't even bother to strip." Cage pushed himself up slowly, moving with a deliberate, agonizing grace that ignored the way the world tilted on its axis. He sat on the bench, forearms braced on his thighs, and lifted his gaze. Despite the blood and the bruising, his eyes remained 2 chips of cold, hard flint. "You enjoying the chair, Rowan?" Cage asked hoarsely. "Is it as comfortable as you imagined when you were whispering in the dark?" Rowan's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He shifted his weight, his fingers twitching toward the heavy baton hanging at his belt. A baton that had belonged to a stadium officer 2 days ago. "Funny," Rowan said, regaining his bravado. "You still think you're in charge. You still think your opinion matters." Cage leaned back against the concrete wall, looking deliberately casual despite the fire screaming through his side. "If you were actually in charge, Rowan, you wouldn't feel the need to come down here and check on me. You'd be too busy running a city. But you're not running a city, are you? You're just babysitting a riot." Rowan's face flushed a deep, ugly purple. "We're fixing what you broke. We're giving the people back their lives." "That's so." Cage's eye flicked over Rowan's shoulder towards the shadows of the hallway. "How long before the life you're giving them includes the one thing I kept out? How long until someone slips through those open gates with a fever they can't hide? Rowan sneered, stepping closer until his face was inches from the bars. You don't get to scare people anymore, Cage. That era is over. We've opened the North Tunnel. We're letting in the families you turned away. Real sanctuary. Cage smiled. It split his lip open further, a fresh bead of blood blooming on the crust. "Aunt, I don't have to scare them, Rowan. The world outside will do that for me. And when it starts eating your real sanctuary from the inside out, don't come looking for me to close the door." Rowan snarled and slammed the baton against the steel bars. The clang was deafening, a bone-shaking vibration that echoed down the hollow corridor like a funeral knell. "You're done," Rowan snapped, his voice cracking. "No one's listening to you now. You're just a ghost in a box." "Then why are you still talking?" Cage asked softly. Rowan stared at him, his chest heaving with a sudden panicked breath. Then he turned on his heel and stormed away, his sloppy footsteps echoing until they were swallowed by the ambient roar of the stadium above. Cage closed his eyes. He didn't need a monitor to know. The stadium wasn't just changing. It was dying. Stacia stood in the central concourse and felt a physical wave of nausea roll over her. The stadium she had entered only days ago was gone. The banners that had marked the sectors, neat, orderly, and disciplined, had been torn down, replaced by jagged graffiti and trash. The patrols were gone, replaced by groups of men lounging against the walls, smoking hoarded tobacco and laughing with a giddy, reckless edge that sounded like hysteria. She saw a pair of men arguing openly near the primary ration station. They were shoving each other, their faces contorted in a petty fury over a canister of fuel. One shoved the other so hard he hit a crate, and a dozen precious ration bars spilled onto the filthy oil-slicked concrete. No one stopped them. No one intervened. People just walked over the food, grinding it into the dirt. Stacia had been released that morning with no explanation. A young guard, a boy she recognized from the intake line, had opened her cell door without a word. He wouldn't meet her eyes. His hands had been shaking. "You're free," he'd muttered, then disappeared into the gloom. Free. The word felt like a lie. She'd known something was fundamentally broken the moment she stepped out of the holding block. The structure of the place, the invisible tension that Cage had maintained like a taut wire, had evaporated. In its place was a cacophony of noise and a terrifying lack of purpose. She moved through the concourse, her heart sinking with every step. She saw a child running past her unattended and crying, his face smeared with grease. She saw a woman screaming at a guard, not in fear, but in a raw, entitlement-fueled fury because the water pressure had dropped. And then she heard it, a sound that made her blood turn to ice. Laughter, too loud, too high-pitched, coming from the direction of the North Access Tunnel. Stacia pushed through a crowd of loiterers and stopped cold. The heavy, pressurized steel doors of the access tunnel, the ones Cage had guarded with his life, were standing wide open. The daylight from outside spilled in, a harsh, unforgiving glare that illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air. Her stomach dropped. "Why is that open?" she demanded, grabbing the arm of the nearest man wearing a makeshift security armband. The man shrugged, leaning lazily against a concrete pillar. "Orders." "Whose orders?" "The new council," he said, a smug grin spreading across his face. "Rowan and Mara. We're not caging people anymore, sweetheart. We're opening the gates to anyone who needs sanctuary. That was the whole point of the kickoff, wasn't it?" The word hit her like a physical blow, caging. Her chest tightened. She looked past the man toward the dark maw of the tunnel that led out into the ruins of the city. She saw people coming in, ragged, stumbling figures. Some looked relieved, others looked wrong. She turned away and began to push through the crowd, her movements frantic now. She scanned faces with a desperate intensity. She saw a woman with fever-bright eyes, leaning against a wall. She saw a man in the distance scratching at the back of his neck, his fingers coming away red and slick. No. Cage had been right. He hadn't been a tyrant for the sake of power. He'd been a dam holding back a flood of filth. And she had helped break the dam. She broke into a run, her boots pounding against the concrete as she headed back toward the only person who understood the magnitude of the disaster. They didn't let her see him at first. The new council had set up shop in Cage's old command center. Stacia had to fight her way through 3 layers of liberated guards who were more interested in posturing than security. She demanded. She shouted. She insulted Rowan's intelligence and Mara's competence to their faces until Mara, a woman with sharp, predatory eyes and a smile like a razor blade, finally looked up from a stack of maps. "You don't get to make demands anymore, Stacia," Mara said softly. "You were a symbol. Symbols are meant to be seen, not heard." Stacia leaned over the table, her face inches from Mara's. The air between them was thick with mutual loathing. "Funny. I thought the whole point was that things were changing, but you're just Cage with worse hair and less brains. You're going to get everyone in this stadium killed by nightfall." Mara's smile widened, but it didn't reach her eyes. "In every revolution, there is a period of adjustment, a risk we are willing to take for the sake of freedom." "You're not taking the risk," Stacia spat. "The 4,000 people sleeping in the stands are taking it. Take me to him. Now." "Why?" Mara asked, tilting her head. "So you can apologize for the mess you made?" "No," Stacia said flatly. "So I can understand exactly how bad this is going to get before the screaming starts." Mara studied her for a long beat, searching for a sign of weakness. Finally, she waved a dismissive hand toward a guard. 5 minutes. If she's not out by then, throw her back in a cell. They led her back down to the holding block. The smell hit her again, stronger now. It was the scent of a tomb that hadn't been sealed properly. As she walked past the cells, she saw the neglect, the overflowing waste buckets, the lack of water. When she reached Cage's cell, she stopped, her breath hitching in her throat. Cage was sitting on the bench, his shoulders slumped forward, his head bowed. For one horrifying, heart-stopping second, she thought he had succumbed to his injuries. He was so still, his skin a sallow, sickly grey in the fluorescent light. "Cage," she whispered. He lifted his head, slowly, painfully. Her chest twisted with a violent surge of guilt. He looked wrecked. One eye was swollen shut, a dark, bruised mass of purple and black. Blood was crusted in the corners of his mouth and smeared across his jaw. His hands were cuffed behind his back, forcing his shoulders into an unnatural, painful position that made the muscles in his neck stand out like cords. He was a broken king in a forgotten dungeon. He looked up at her, and even through the swelling, his one good eye burned with a terrifying, lucid intelligence. Then he smiled. It was a bloody, jagged expression. "Well," he rasped, the sound vibrating with a dark irony. "If it isn't the face of the revolution, come to see the view from the other side of the bars." Stacia's eyes blurred with tears she refused to let fall. "What did they do to you? You look—" "God, Cage." "They asked me to stop being right," he said, his voice a low, rhythmic growl. "I declined. They found my lack of cooperation frustrating." She stepped closer, her forehead nearly touching the cold steel. The proximity allowed her to see the fine tremors in his hands, the way his chest hitched with every breath. "This place is falling apart," she said, her voice a frantic whisper. "They've opened the north tunnel. They're letting everyone in without scans. I saw people. I saw the signs, Cage. The fever. The scratching." Cage's smile faded instantly. His posture straightened, a grim professional focus taking hold of him, despite his condition. "How long has the tunnel been open?" "Since this morning. Maybe 6 hours." 6 hours, Cage repeated, his voice hollow. "Then it's already over. The incubation period for the current strain is 4. The first carriers are already in the kitchens. They're in the sleeping quarters. They're everywhere." Silence stretched between them, heavy and intimate. The ambient noise of the stadium seemed to fade, leaving only the sound of their breathing and the drip of a leaky pipe somewhere in the dark. "I didn't want this," she said, her voice breaking. "I wanted them to be treated like people, not numbers. I didn't want a massacre." "I know," Cage replied quietly. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and the anger she expected wasn't there. There was only a profound, weary sadness. "That's the tragedy of people like you, Stacia. You think the world is as kind as you are. You don't realize that the rules aren't there to stifle life. They're there to protect it." His words hurt worse than a physical strike. She swallowed hard, her hands curling into fists. "You tried to stop it. You tried to warn me." "Yes. And I didn't listen. I called you a tyrant." "No," he said. "You didn't listen, but neither did I. I should have shown you the cost instead of just telling you the price. Cage leaned forward as far as the cuffs would allow, his face pressed near the bars. If I hated every person who helped break this place, he said, his voice dropping to a velvet rasp, I'd have no one left to fight for. I don't hate you, Stacia. I'm just sorry you had to learn this way. Their gazes locked. The air between the bars felt charged, pressurized by the looming disaster outside. She could see the pulse jumping in the hollow of his throat. She could see the way his jaw clenched when he shifted, the agony of his shoulders radiating off him in waves. You're hurt, she said softly, reaching out a hand, then pulling it back. I've been worse, he replied, though the sweat on his brow suggested otherwise. I need you out, she said, her voice regaining its strength, its fire. The council. They're playing house while the walls are burning. They won't know what to do when the first one turns. Cage studied her for a long moment. That's not your call anymore, Stacia. You're just a guest in Rowan's kingdom now. I'll make it my call, she said fiercely. I started this fire. I'm going to be the one to put it out. They won't survive the night without you. I won't survive without you. Cage's eyes searched hers, looking for the girl who had challenged him at the gate. He found her. But she was different now. The naivety was gone, replaced by a cold, hard resolve that mirrored his own. And you? He asked quietly. Will you be able to do what needs to be done once the gates are closed again? The question landed deep in her soul. Stacia didn't answer right away. She knew what he was asking. He was asking if she was ready to be the monster. If she was ready to hold the gun. Outside the cell, at the far end of the corridor, a scream echoed. It was sharp, sudden, and cut off with a wet, gurgling sound that made the hair on Stacia's arms stand up. Cage's head snapped toward the sound. The weary prisoner vanished, replaced by the predator. That's the first, he said, his voice grim and final. Her blood ran cold. First what? The first slip, Cage said. The first one to turn inside the walls. Once the chain reaction starts, it doesn't stop until there's nothing left to eat. Without thinking, Stacia reached through the bars. She wrapped her fingers around his forearm, her skin ghosting over the scars there. The contact jolted them both. A spark of pure, unadulterated reality in a world of crumbling illusions. His skin was fever-hot, but his grip, even cuffed, felt like an anchor. Cage sucked in a sharp, jagged breath. Whether it was from the pain in his shoulders or the shock of her touch, she couldn't tell. Stacia, he warned, his voice low and dangerous, think very carefully about what you're about to do. I've thought enough, she said, her eyes flashing. Get ready. I'm not leaving you in this hole to be a snack for Rowan's mistakes. His gaze dropped to where her hand gripped his arm, then lifted back to her face. His expression was dark, unreadable, and intensely focused. You break me out of this cell, he said, his voice dropping to a rough, gravelly whisper, and there's no going back to the girl you were. You become part of the machine. You become the wall. She met his stare, her pulse pounding in her ears like a drum. I already burned that bridge when I walked into the command center. I'm not looking for a way back, I'm looking for a way through. Another scream rang out, closer this time, followed by the frantic thud of running feet and the sound of a heavy door being slammed. Cage's jaw tightened, the tendons in his neck straining. Then do it, he said, his voice a command. Find the override. It's a manual release under the desk in the guard station. Do it now, Stacia, before this place eats itself alive. She released him reluctantly, the absence of his warmth feeling like a cold void. She turned toward the door of the holding block, her heart racing, her mind already calculating the path to the guard station. Behind her, Cage watched her go. He watched the woman who had challenged him, defied him, and helped destroy his carefully constructed world, and saw her transforming into the only partner he'd ever truly had. For the first time since the coup, something dangerous and feral stirred in Cage's chest. It wasn't hope. Hope was for the people outside the walls. It was resolve. And it was hungry. Chapter 4. When the walls fell, the scream didn't stop. It was a jagged, piercing sound that shredded the heavy silence of the holding block, echoing through the stadium's concrete arteries until it multiplied. It bounced off the cold steel of the lockers and the ribbed reinforcement of the ceilings, becoming something bigger than a single person's fear. It became an atmospheric pressure, a contagious panic that sat heavy in the lungs. Stacia burst out of the holding corridor at a dead run, her heart hammering against her ribs with such violence she felt as if they might crack under the strain. The air had shifted. It was no longer just the stagnant smell of neglect. It was thicker, sour, and laced with the undeniable metallic tang of fresh blood and the ozone of shorting electrical wires. She skidded to a stop at the end of the primary concourse, her boots sliding on a slick of something she didn't want to identify. Chaos had arrived, and it had brought its own geography. People were running in every direction, a panicked, directionless tide. They slammed into each other, shouting warnings that contradicted one another in a cacophony of terror. A man stumbled past her, his face a mask of shock, clutching an arm where deep, ragged teeth marks were already darkening the skin into a bruised, necrotic purple. A woman screamed for her child, her voice breaking into a shrill, jagged hysterics as she shoved through the crowd with a feral strength. The north access tunnel gaped wide. Too wide, it looked like an open wound in the side of the fortress. Something burst out of the darkness of the tunnel, something fast, something fundamentally wrong. Its limbs jerked at angles that defied human anatomy, moving with a twitchy, predatory speed that made Stacia's stomach drop. The infected man, his eyes clouded over with a milky, stagnant film, slammed into a guard. He knocked the armed man down with a burst of impossible strength. The guard screamed once, a high, thin sound, before the creature's teeth found the soft, vulnerable meat of the throat. The scream cut off with a wet, sickening pop. Stacia staggered back, her breath hitching in a throat that felt like it was filled with dry wool. This was exactly what Cage had warned about. This was the mathematical certainty he had tried to prevent with his bars and his cold hard no. And it was only the beginning. Gunfire erupted from the levels above. The shots were frantic, poorly aimed, ricocheting off the concrete walls with high-pitched zings. Someone dropped a heavy rifle and didn't even stop to pick it up, their boots thundering as they fled towards the upper stands. Another infected came through the tunnel, then another, their silhouettes dark against the glare of the outside world. Suddenly the concourse was full of bodies, the living, the dead, and the horrific things caught in between. "Fall back! Seal the inner ring!" someone shouted from the mezzanine. No one listened. The chain of command hadn't just broken. It had been pulverized. Stacia turned and ran, her mind screaming a single name. Cage heard it all from the suffocating confines of his cell. He heard the screams, he heard the gunfire, he heard the unmistakable rhythmic thud of something heavy, something that didn't feel pain, slamming into the bars of the cells farther down the corridor. Each impact sent a vibration through the floor, a pulse of impending doom. He rose slowly, his body protesting with a chorus of agony. Pain flared through his cracked ribs like a brand, and his jaw was clenched so hard he felt his teeth might shatter. But beneath the pain, something else was taking over. Adrenaline, cold and sharp, flooded his system, numbing the bruises and the exhaustion. They'd opened the gates too soon. They'd let the world in before they were ready to handle its teeth. The footsteps came fast this time, panicked, uneven, the stride of someone who knew death was a few heartbeats behind them. A guard skidded to a stop outside his cell. It was the same boy from earlier, his face now the color of ash, his eyes dilated until they were almost entirely black with terror. "Unlock it," Cage barked. He stood tall, his presence filling the cell, the sheer force of his will making the boy flinch. The guard's hands were shaking so violently the keys rattled against the lock. Rowan said you stay in. He said you were the danger." "Rowan is dead or hiding," Cage snapped, his voice a low, lethal growl. "And if you don't unlock this door right now, you're going to die screaming in this hallway with me watching. Unlock it." That did it. The boy's survival instinct finally overrode his orders. The lock clicked, the bolt slid back, and the door swung open. Cage surged forward like a spring-loaded trap. He grabbed the guard by the front of his vest, not out of malice, but for leverage. "The keys. Give them to me." He wrenched the cuffs off his own wrists. As soon as the boy fumbled them open, the sudden release of pressure sent a white-hot flare of agony through his joints, but he shoved it into a dark corner of his mind. There would be time to feel later, if there was a later. "Where's the girl?" "Stacia," he demanded, his fingers digging into the boy's shoulders. The guard shook his head, his breath coming in shallow sobs. I don't know. She ran for the concourse. Everyone's running. Cage swore under his breath, a short, sharp curse. He shoved the boy toward the exit. Go, get to the upper levels and lock the stairwell. Move. Cage took off at a run, his boots pounding against the concrete. The stadium was vibrating now, the very foundations shaking with the weight of too many bodies moving in a blind, panicked mass. He could smell the smoke. Someone had knocked over a heater or a stove in the chaos. He reached the central concourse just in time to see a nightmare unfolding. Stacia was a whirlwind of desperate motion. She slammed into a group of fleeing survivors, spun on her heel, and shoved a dazed man out of the way just as an infected woman lunged for him. Stacia didn't have a gun, but she had a heavy length of industrial pipe. She brought it down with a sickening wet crack across the creature's skull. The infected collapsed into a heap of twitching limbs. Stacia stood over it for a second, her chest heaving, her hair wild and matted with sweat. Her eyes were wide, darting, looking for the next threat in a world that had suddenly become nothing but threats. Cage didn't slow down. He didn't call her name. He just moved. He caught her by the upper arm and yanked her back with a force that nearly off-balanced her, just as another infected, a former dock worker Cage recognized, crashed into the empty space where she had been standing a heartbeat before. Stacia spun, the pipe raised to strike, until she saw his face. She slammed into his chest, her momentum carrying her into him. He was solid, immovable, a pillar of iron in a sea of fluid terror. For one breathless, suspended second, they were pressed together amid the screaming chaos. Her hands fisted in his black thermal shirt, her knuckles white. His grip was an iron band on her arm, grounding her. "You came back," she gasped, her voice raw. "I told you to get ready," he shot back, his eyes scanning the room over her head. "Move. Now." He didn't let go of her. He dragged her with him, his voice rising above the din, barking orders at the scattering guards with the authority of a man who had never truly lost his throne. "Seal the inner gates. Fire in bursts, not spray. You. Get those people to the ramps. Don't let them cluster." A few guards, seeing the man who had run the stadium for years suddenly back in the fray, felt their training kick in. They began to form a line, but most were too far gone. The stadium was a lost cause. The infection had too many entry points, and the panic was a more effective killer than the virus itself. They reached a service corridor choked with thick, acrid smoke. Fire alarms began to wail overhead, a rhythmic, piercing shriek that made communication nearly impossible. Somewhere above them, a massive explosion rocked the structure, a secondary generator failing or a fuel line catching, sending a shower of orange sparks and white dust raining down from the ceiling. "Exit route," Stacia shouted over the roar of the fire. Cage didn't hesitate. He knew every inch of the stadium's guts. Maintenance tunnel under the west stands. It leads to the old subway bypass. If it's not overrun, we can get clear of the perimeter. And if it is... He stopped for a microsecond, meeting her piercing green eyes. His own were hard, burning with a feral terminal light. "Then we make it not overrun." They ran. The tunnel was a tomb, lit only by emergency LED strips that flickered weakly, casting long, jerking shadows against the damp walls. The sound of the stadium behind them was a distant, muffled roar now, the sound of a world ending. Screaming, the staccato of failing rifles and the wet, animalistic tearing noises of the hungry things feeding in the dark. Stacia's lungs burned as if she were breathing glass. Her legs were trembling, the adrenaline beginning to leak out, replaced by a crushing fatigue. She stumbled, her foot catching on a piece of protruding rebar. Cage caught her without breaking his stride. He hauled her back upright with one powerful arm, his grip almost painful. "Don't slow down, Stacia," he growled, his voice right in her ear. "We stop. We die." "I'm fine," she snapped, though her knees threatened to buckle again. She shoved her hair out of her face, her skin smudged with soot and blood. You don't have to lie to me," Cage said, his eyes never leaving the darkness ahead. That made her laugh. A sharp, hysterical sound that echoed off the tunnel walls. "Funny time to get honest, Cage, right when everything we built is a charcoal pit." They burst out of the end of the tunnel into the night air. The cold hit her like a physical slap, shocking the heat out of her lungs. After the suffocating pressure of the stadium, the open space felt terrifyingly vast. Behind them, the stadium glowed with a hellish internal fire. Plumes of thick black smoke poured out through the open access points, obscuring the stars. The screams still echoed, carried toward them on a biting winter wind, sounding like the cries of a wounded beast. Stacia turned, her hands covering her mouth, horror clawing up her throat. She looked at the monument to survival she had helped dismantle. "We failed," she whispered. "Everything, all of them. We failed." Cage stood beside her, his chest rising and falling in heavy rhythmic heaves. His jaw was set tight enough to crack bone. He didn't look back at the fire. He looked at the dark horizon, at the ruins of the city that were waiting for them. "No," he said, his voice like iron. "We survived. The rest is just history." She looked at him then, really looked at him in the flickering orange light of the burning fortress. Blood streaked his face from a dozen small cuts. The bruises on his jaw and temple had darkened into deep, ugly shades of charcoal and plum. He looked wrecked, dangerous, and devastatingly real. He was a man who had lost his kingdom and his purpose in a single night, yet he stood there like he was ready to fight the darkness itself. This man had built a miracle in a graveyard, and she had been the one to hand the graveyard a shovel. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice finally breaking. "Cage, I'm so sorry. I didn't see. I didn't want to see." Cage didn't answer immediately. He turned to her, and for the first time the distance between them vanished without a struggle. He reached out and cupped the back of her neck, his thumb pressing firmly into the pulse point below her ear. The touch was grounding. An anchor in the middle of a storm. It was possessive without being cruel, steady without being soft. "I know," he said quietly. The night hummed around them, the sound of crickets, distant, mournful howls from the city ruins, and the rhythmic crackle of the fire behind them. Stacia leaned into his hand without thinking, her eyes closing. The touch felt like the only real thing left in a world of ghosts. The moment between them snapped tight, the tension they'd been fighting since the gate finally collapsing under the weight of their shared disaster. Cage's breath hitched. His hand tightened slightly, his fingers threading into the tangled dark strands of her hair. He pulled her a fraction closer until they were breathing the same cold air. "You don't get to fall apart yet," he murmured, his voice a rough velvet. "Not while we're still breathing. Not while I'm still standing here." Her hands slid up his chest, her fingers gripping the rough fabric of his jacket. She could feel the heavy, thudding beat of his heart through the layers. "I don't want to go back," she said, her voice a desperate plea. "To that, to the cages, to the walls. I can't be that person anymore." "Good," he said, his voice dropping to a rasp, "because there's nothing left to go back to. The walls are down, Stacia, for better or worse." The realization settled between them. Heavy, final, and strangely liberating. They were alone now. There were no rules to enforce, no ranks to maintain, and no walls to hide behind. There was only the man who kept the gates and the woman who broke them. Cage leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. His breath was warm against her lips, smelling of copper and smoke. The pull between them was undeniable now, an attraction sharpened by the proximity of death and the raw, stripping knowledge that tomorrow wasn't a promise, but a gamble. "Tell me to stop," he said, his voice a ghost of a command. She didn't. She couldn't. Their mouths crashed together, not with the gentleness of a beginning, but with the desperation of an end. It was a collision of teeth, breath, and a pent-up need that had been building since she'd first challenged him on the boulevard. His hand slid from her neck to her waist, his arm an iron band that pulled her hard against his body, as if he could merge her into his own skin. Stacia gasped into his mouth, her fingers digging into the hard muscle of his shoulders. The kiss burned. It was a cocktail of everything they hadn't allowed themselves to feel. Anger at the world, relief at being alive, and a raw, feral desire that had been stripped of all its polite pretenses. Cage broke the kiss first, though he didn't pull away. His forehead remained pressed to hers, his breath ragged and hot in the cold night. "If we do this," he said hoarsely, his eyes searching hers in the dark, "it won't be clean. It won't be easy. I don't know how to be soft, Stacia." She smiled shakily, a small, defiant light returning to her eyes. Nothing in this world is ever clean, Cage. I'm not looking for soft. I'm looking for real. Another roar echoed from the stadium behind them, the sound of a major section of the West Stand collapsing in on itself. A plume of embers shot into the sky like a swarm of angry fireflies. Cage took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers, his grip firm and unwavering. "Then we move," he said, his voice reclaiming its authority. "We move before the world finishes falling apart around us." Stacia squeezed his fingers, grounding herself in the warmth of his grip. She looked one last time at the burning stadium, at the ruins of the sanctuary that had become a cage, and then at the man standing beside her. Together they turned their backs on the fire and disappeared into the sprawling, dangerous dark of the city. Two survivors carrying the crushing weight of a broken world and the crushing weight of a broken world and the flickering, dangerous spark of something entirely new. Chapter 5. The Quiet After the Fire. By the third day outside the stadium's long, jagged shadow, Cage stopped pretending he was fine. The adrenaline that had fueled their frantic escape, the same fire that had allowed him to ignore cracked ribs and a concussive blow to the temple, had finally burned out, leaving a cold, hollow ache in its wake. It was the kind of pain that settled deep into the marrow, a relentless grinding of bone and spirit that refused to be ignored. His left side was a topographical map of trauma. Bruises bloomed in shades of midnight purple and sickly yellow, spreading across his torso. His shoulder was stiff, the skin around the jagged tear in his deltoid pulled tight and angry, glowing a feverish red despite Stacia's meticulous cleaning every time they stopped. He still walked 10 paces ahead of her. He still took point, his eyes scanning the horizon with the mechanical precision of a man who believed habit alone could stitch him back together. But the looseness was gone from his stride. Every step was a calculated risk against the gravity that wanted to pull him down. Stacia noticed. She noticed the way his breathing hitched when they climbed a rise, and the way his hand hovered near his sidearm not out of readiness, but to steady the trembling in his arm. She didn't comment at first. She'd learned that Cage heard concern as a direct challenge to his utility, and in this world, being useless was the same as being dead. He moved through a landscape that had forgotten the meaning of mercy. The roads were choked with the skeletal remains of the old world. Weeds pushed through the asphalt like slow-motion explosions, and rusted-out cars sat like hollowed-out beetles, their interiors filled with the dust of people long gone. So, on the fourth morning, as a grey, misty dawn broke over the jagged tree line, they skirted the ruins of a small town. Smoke curled into the air from the main street, a thin, oily black ribbon. "People," Stacia murmured, her hand instinctively dropping to the hilt of the knife at her belt. Cage crouched behind a rusted guardrail, the movement costing him a suppressed groan. He adjusted the focus on the binoculars they'd scavenged from a ranger station. He watched the way the figures moved near the smoke, jagged, erratic, and carrying the heavy, oversized weapons of men who enjoyed the weight of them. "Not the kind we want to meet," Cage whispered. "Scavengers, maybe Rowan stragglers. They're hunting." She trusted his instinct. It was a primal thing, honed by years of playing God at a gate. They detoured east, cutting through overgrown fields where scarecrows still stood like grim sentinels, their flannel shirts rotting off wooden frames. One of them shifted in a sudden gust of wind, and Stacia's pulse spiked. Cage flicked a glance back at her over his shoulder. "Still jumpy?" "Still alive?" she shot back, though her heart was drumming against her ribs. A corner of his mouth twitched. The ghost of a smile, even now caked in dried blood and grey with exhaustion. He was infuriatingly, devastatingly handsome. The stubble had become a thick, dark beard that defined his jaw. His eyes were sharp, gold-flecked flint, and his posture remained stubbornly unbowed. He looked like a man who would argue with the Reaper until the scythe hit the floor. They found the clinic just before noon. It was a squat brick building on the town's outskirts, its windows boarded with plywood that had begun to rot. An old ambulance sat in the driveway, its rear doors hanging open like broken teeth. Stacia checked the perimeter, moving with a silent, fluid grace she hadn't known she possessed a month ago, while Cage forced the side door. The lock gave way with a piercing, metallic shriek that echoed through the quiet street. They waited, frozen for a count of 10. Nothing moved but the dust. Inside, the air was stagnant, smelling of old antiseptic, dust, and something sharply chemical. The floor was a carpet of patient files and broken glass. 5 minutes, Cage rasped, leaning heavily against a filing cabinet. 10 if we're pushing our luck. You sit, Stacia ordered, pointing at a toppled gurney in the hallway. He didn't argue. That terrified her more than any threat. He sank onto the metal frame, his head dropping into his hands, his shoulders heaving with the effort of simply staying upright. Stacia moved with frantic efficiency. She raided the shattered cabinets, her fingers flying over labels, bandages, gauze, a bottle of antiseptic that hadn't leaked. She found a small, half-empty bottle of broad-spectrum antibiotics and clutched it to her chest as if it was solid gold. Finally, she found a blister pack of high-grade painkillers, expired by years, but in this world, expiration was just a suggestion. She returned to him and stopped short. In the harsh, clinical light of the hallway, his damage was undeniable. Jesus, Cage, she breathed. I've had worse, he muttered, his eyes closed. Sweat beaded along his hairline despite the chill in the room. Liar, she said, her voice a mix of frustration and a tenderness she couldn't hide. She knelt between his knees and began to cut away the blood-stiffened fabric of his shirt. As the layers came away, she sucked in a breath. The wound on his shoulder was weeping, the edges swollen and puckered. She worked in silence, cleaning the grime away with a damp cloth before pouring the antiseptic. Cage hissed, his fingers digging into the edge of the gurney until the metal groaned. Don't start, he warned, his jaw locked. Then don't bleed, she countered, though her hands were as gentle as they were steady. She worked with an intimacy that was new to them. Her fingers brushed against the hard planes of his chest, tracing the older scars that told the story of his life before her. Every wince he made felt like a needle under her own skin. When she pressed the fresh gauze against his ribs to tape them, his eyes flew open, locking onto hers. They were dark, swimming with pain, but also something deeper, a raw, naked intensity that made her breath hitch. Just don't stop, he whispered. The words weren't just about the bandages. They hung in the air, heavy with a shared desperate need for the presence of the other. She finished the dressing, shoved 2 of the pills into his hand and held the canteen to his lips. He drank greedily, his throat bobbing as he swallowed. Yes, ma'am, he murmured, a trace of his old arrogance returning to his voice. She snorted, a small shaky laugh, and helped him stand. They were out the door before the town could wake up to their presence. On the 6th night, the sky finally broke. The rain came down in a cold, relentless deluge, turning the world into a blurred landscape of grey and black. They found shelter in a farmhouse that was half collapsed on its eastern side, but the master bedroom and an adjacent bathroom remained miraculously intact. Stacia dropped her pack on the floor and slumped against the doorframe, her clothes clinging to her like a second freezing skin. Cage stood in the center of the room, swaying slightly. That's it, she said, her voice firm. You're done pretending. We stay here until you're healed, or until I have to bury you. Stacia, I'm fine. She crossed the room in 2 strides, her finger jabbing hard into his chest right above his heart. You are bleeding through your fresh bandages, you're running a fever, and if you say I'm fine one more time, I will knock you out myself. Cage stared at her, the raindrops dripping from his beard. Then he laughed, a low, rough sound that turned into a wincing cough. Bossy, he murmured, his gaze dropping to her mouth. You like it, she shot back, her heart racing for a reason that had nothing to do with the escape. They found a small rusted hand pump in the bathroom. To their shock, it still worked, drawing water from a deep well. Stacia filled the porcelain tub, the sound of the water loud and rhythmic in the quiet house. It's going to be cold, she said. I don't care, Cage replied. He began to strip, his movements stiff and pained. Stacia didn't turn away. She watched him, and then she began to peel off her own sodden layers. There was no modesty left between them, only the raw physical reality of 2 people who had survived the end of the world together. She stepped into the tub first, the icy water making her skin erupt in goosebumps. She gasped as the chill hit her. Cage climbed in behind her. The tub was small, forcing them together. His knees bracketed her hips, his large scarred hands settling on her waist to steady her. The contact sent a jolt of pure heat through her, a stark contrast to the freezing water. They washed each other in the dim light of a single lantern. Stacia worked a sliver of soap into his hair, her fingers careful around the gash on his scalp. Cage closed his eyes, leaning back against her chest, surrendering to her touch in a way he never had before. When it was his turn, his hands were reverent. He mapped the curves of her body with a slow, deliberate focus, his palms grazing the line of her throat, the swell of her breasts, and the strength in her thighs. When they stood to dry off, dripping and shivering, the air in the small bathroom felt thick, pressurized with a tension that had nothing to do with the cold. Cage pulled her against him, his wet skin sliding against hers. He lowered his forehead to hers, his breath hitching. "You should have left me at the gate," he whispered. Stacia looked up at him, her eyes bright with defiance. "And missed the chance to tell you I told you so for the next 40 years? Hard pass, Cage." His mouth curved into a real smile, small, stunned, and dangerous. They dried off with scavenged, scratchy towels and moved to the bedroom. Cage let her rewrap his wounds without protest. When she was finished, her hands lingered on his shoulders, her thumbs tracing the line of his collarbone. "So," she said softly, "this is the part where you tell me I'm making a mistake, that I should find a nice, safe group and leave the tyrant behind." Cage caught her wrists, his grip firm. "No." The word was absolute, a promise. She leaned in and kissed him. It wasn't the desperate, frantic collision they'd shared at the stadium. This was slow, intentional, and deeply exploratory. Their mouths fit together with a perfect, terrifying symmetry. His hands slid into her damp hair, pulling her closer until there was no space left between them. "Last chance," she murmured against his lips. "I'm done running," he said, his voice a low growl of intent. They moved to the mattress. In the flickering lantern light, the world outside, the fire, the infected, the betrayal, ceased to exist. There was only the heat of their bodies and the weight of their breath. Cage was careful, moving with a controlled power that respected his injuries, while Stacia was fierce, her touch demanding and attentive. It was a beautiful, violent collision of wanton trust. He tasted of salt and iron, she tasted of rain and wood smoke. They learned the language of each other's skin, mapping every scar and every curve. When the final crescendo came, it felt like a rebirth, a stripping away of the armor they had both worn for so long. The weeks that followed were a blur of miles and mountains. The air grew thinner and colder as they pushed into Montana. The land began to open up, wide and majestic, the sky a vast, bruised blue that made the stadium feel like a distant, bad dream. They found the farm in a shallow valley. It was a place time had forgotten, a sturdy 2-story farmhouse with a wraparound porch, surrounded by fields of tall golden grass that sighed in the wind. A river cut through the edge of the property, the sound of rushing water a constant, soothing hum. They stood on the porch together as the sun began to dip behind the peaks, casting long purple shadows across the valley. "This could work," Cage said, his arm draped over her shoulders. He looked healed, stronger, his eyes no longer haunted by the weight of 4,000 lives. Stacia leaned into him, resting her head against his chest. "This could be ours." They didn't talk about the stadium. They didn't speak of Rowan or the gates. Some things didn't need to be exhumed to be laid to rest. They simply buried them in the quiet of the mountains. They began again, slower this time. They planted hardy crops in the rich soil. They scavenged the nearby small towns for tools and seeds. They reinforced the house against the winter. Cage's body healed, the scars becoming part of the landscape of his skin. Stacia learned the rhythms of the land, the way the wind changed before a storm, and the way the stars looked when there was no smoke to hide them. At night, they held each other in the big bed upstairs, their bodies a warm bulwark against the cold. They had survived the fire, the collapse, and the betrayal of their own ideals. Now they would build something beautiful and lasting from the quiet that followed. They were no longer the man who kept the gates or the woman who broke them. They were simply two people finally free in a world that was beginning to breathe again. Epilogue: What grows after? The first thing Cage rebuilt was the fence. It wasn't the old stadium walls, monolithic concrete, rusted rebar, and the suffocating scent of industrialized fear, but it mattered just as much. Post by post, he reclaimed the perimeter of the small Montana valley. He worked with a heavy iron mallet, the rhythm of his strikes echoing against the silent mountains like the beating of a slow, steady heart. He stretched the wire tight until it sang when plucked, defining a boundary that was less about keeping the world out and more about inviting a sense of sanctity in. It was a warning system, a line in the dirt that allowed them to finally close their eyes at night without one hand on a blade. Stacia watched him from the porch, her fingers wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug of coffee. The steam curled into the crisp morning air, smelling of chicory and wood smoke. He moved differently now. The frantic, jagged energy of the Tyrant had been tempered into something smoother, like a stone worn down by a persistent river. He wasn't slower, his strength was still a formidable physical weight, but he was quieter, more deliberate. The man who had once ruled a city-state with an iron fist now measured his movements, pacing his exertion, resting when his body demanded it. The injuries he'd carried out of the burning stadium never truly left him. They had simply become part of his architecture. His shoulder still stiffened in the autumn frost. His ribs ached when the barometric pressure dropped before a storm. But they were scars now, not open wounds. She liked them. To her, they were a map of their shared survival, a tactile history written in silvered tissue. The old floorboards creaked as she stepped off the porch. The land smelled intoxicating, rich, damp soil, pine needles, and the electric promise of a spring that had come late but stubborn. Green shoots were pushing up through the mulch of a decade's neglect, reclaiming the graveyard. "You're leaning the posts to the west?" she called out, her voice clear and teasing. Cage didn't look up, but she saw the corner of his mouth twitch beneath his thick, dark beard. "They'll settle into the grade, Stacia. Give it a week." "They'll collapse the first time a stray elk decided to scratch its itch," she countered, stopping beside him. He finally straightened, his shirt damp with sweat clinging to the heavy muscles of his back and chest. He looked at her, his eyes, once so cold and calculating, now warm with a proprietary glow. He held out the mallet. "You volunteering to do it better or just here to provide the commentary?" She took the mallet, her hand brushing his. The contact sent a familiar, low-voltage hum through her veins. She squared her shoulders and drove the next post in with 3 clean, perfect strikes. "There," she said, wiping a smudge of dirt from her forehead. "Competence. You should try it sometime." Cage laughed. A deep, resonant sound that filled the valley. It still caught her off guard, the sheer vulnerability of his joy. It was a sound he never would have allowed himself back when the weight of 4,000 lives sat on his shoulders. They had claimed the kitchen first. In the early weeks, when the house was still a drafty, cobwebbed shell, they had focused all their energy there. It wasn't just about utility. It was about the ritual of life. They had scrubbed years of abandonment away until their fingernails bled. They repaired the shelves and dragged a heavy oak table in from the barn, sanding it down until grain felt like silk under their palms. They ate there every night, bathed in the amber glow of oil lamps. Sometimes the meals were humble, scavenged beans and salt pork. Other times the land was generous. Stacia had become an expert at the river, pulling fat silver trout from the cold water, while Cage had mastered the art of the smokehouse. "Hopeful idiot," Cage had muttered months ago when she'd insisted on planting a garden in the frost-nipped earth of March. He'd watched her from the doorway, his arms crossed, a look of profound skepticism on his face. She'd flipped him off, her knees caked in mud, and kept watering the seeds. When the first pale green sprouts broke through the dirt, Cage had stood over them for a long time, silent. He hadn't said a word, but the next day he'd built a cold frame out of old window sashes to protect them. Their intimacy had changed as the seasons bled into one another. It had evolved from the desperate, frantic hunger of the escape into something deep, intentional, and infinitely more dangerous. It was a slow-burn devotion. It was the way his hand lingered on the small of her back when they passed in the hallway. It was the way she leaned her head against his shoulder when they were too tired to speak. "I tell you what, cheek," They bathed in the river together when the weather allowed, the water a shocking crystalline cold that made their skin tingle. They would scrub the dirt from each other's backs, their hands wandering with a familiarity that was both reverent and playful. In the water, stripped of their clothes and their history, they were simply two bodies, alive and vibrant against the backdrop of a broken world. At night, the bedroom upstairs became their sanctuary. It smelled of lavender Stacia had dried and the lingering scent of Cage's tobacco. The wind brushed the window panes gently, a soothing lullaby compared to the rhythmic metallic clanging of the stadium. She often woke tangled in his arms, his body a furnace against her back. He slept possessively, one heavy arm draped over her waist, as if even in sleep he was guarding his most precious resource. Stacia would lie there in the pre-dawn grey, watching the lines of his face soften, the tyrant replaced by a man who had finally found a place where he didn't have to be a wall. For rebuilding was a slow, grueling adventure. The barn roof had taken nearly a month of back-breaking labour. The well pump had required Cage to scavenge parts from 3 different towns, a week-long journey that had left Stacia pacing the porch until she saw his silhouette on the ridge. In return, she taught him how to read the land, how to tell the difference between a predator's tracks and a scavenger's, and how to hear the specific silence that preceded a change in the weather. They argued, of course. Their tempers were too sharp and their wills too strong for a quiet life. They fought over the irrigation of the potato patch, over whether to trust the occasional traveller who wandered into their valley, and over the lingering ghosts of the past. "You're still looking for a threat in every shadow," Stacia snapped one evening after Cage had chased off a pair of bedraggled teenagers with a shotgun. "They were just kids, Cage. They were hungry." "They were scouts," Cage replied, his voice level but hard. "Patterns don't change just because the world ended, Stacia. You give a little, and they take everything. I've seen it happen 100 times." "You're not at the gate anymore," she shouted, her eyes flashing. "You don't have to be the monster to keep me safe." Cage stepped into her space, his presence overwhelming. He didn't shout. He leaned in until their chests touched. "I don't trust the world," he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly rasp. "But I trust you, and I won't lose this. I won't lose you because I was too soft to see a blade coming." The honesty of it, the raw, naked fear of losing her, shut her up faster than any order ever could. She reached up, cupping his face, her thumb stroking the scar on his jaw. "You won't lose me," she whispered, "but let's try to be human while we're at it, okay?" Summer brought a riot of colour to the valley. Wildflowers, lupine and paintbrush crept into the pastures. The garden grew unruly and lush, squash vines curling like emerald snakes around the stakes Cage had built. Their physical connection deepened, becoming the language they used when words failed. Their lovemaking was no longer an act of survival. It was a celebration. It was slow, appreciative, and deeply sensual. Cage would trace every inch of her with his mouth, his hands mapping the strength in her shoulders and the softness of her belly with a hunger that never seemed to diminish. Stacia would pull him down into her, her fingers digging into the hard muscles of his back, grounding them both in the present. Sometimes, in the quiet after, Stacia would think about the girl she'd been, the one who had marched up to the stadium gates with nothing but a heart full of righteous fury. And Cage would think about the man who had looked at her through the bars and seen only a problem to be solved. Neither of them regretted the fire. The fire had burned the world down, but it had cleared the ground for something that could actually grow. The first winter was their greatest test. The snow came early and stayed late, burying the valley in a deep, suffocating white silence. They stayed close to the hearth, conserving their energy, reading salvaged books by the flickering light of the fireplace. Cage's shoulder ached constantly in the damp cold, and Stacia's hands became cracked and raw from the endless chores. But the house held, and more importantly, they held each other. On the longest night of the year, a blizzard howled outside, shaking the very foundations of the farmhouse. Cage stood at the window, watching the white ash of the snow pile up against the glass. "Do you think it'll ever go back?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the wind. to the way it was, cities, crowds, laws that people actually follow. Stacia came up behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist and pressing her face into the warmth of his back. "I don't know," she murmured. "I don't think so. Not in our lifetime." He turned in her arms, looking down at her. "Does that scare you?" She looked at the fire dancing in the hearth, then back at him. "No, I don't want it to go back. I don't want to be a number in a crowd again. I like who we are here." Cage leaned down, kissing her with a slow, lingering heat. "Me too," he whispered. By the second spring, they weren't just surviving, they were thriving. The farm had a rhythm now, a symphony of planting, tending, repairing, and resting. Cage had built a second perimeter fence further out, a gesture of foresight rather than fear. Stacia had expanded the garden, adding a section for medicinal herbs and a row of stubborn, beautiful roses she'd rescued from a collapsed greenhouse in a nearby town. They began to talk about a future that extended beyond the next harvest. "Kids?" Stacia asked one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the peaks in shades of violet and gold. Her voice was casual, but her heart was racing. Cage went perfectly still. He didn't look at her for a long time. Stacia felt a cold prickle of panic. "Forget it, I shouldn't have. It's a crazy world to bring someone into." "No," Cage said, turning to her. His expression was unreadable. "I mean, I've thought about it. More than once." Stacia raised an eyebrow, a small smile playing at her lips. "You? The man who likes everything in its place? Plan for a tiny, chaotic person who won't follow your rules?" He huffed, a self-deprecating sound. "I'd be terrible at it. I'd probably try to teach a toddler how to strip a rifle before they could walk." "You'd be terrifying," she corrected, leaning into him. "But you'd also be the best shield a kid could ever have." Cage pulled her onto his lap, his chin resting on her head. "That's not a no, Stacia." "No," she agreed, her heart full. "It's definitely not." They didn't rush. They had learned the hard way that rushing destroyed things. They let the idea take root, like everything else on the farm. Occasional travelers still came through. A woman with a young, wide-eyed son had stayed with them for a week during the midsummer heat. Cage had hesitated, his hand on his holster, but then he'd seen the exhaustion in the woman's eyes, the same look he'd seen 1,000 times at the stadium gates. He'd stepped aside and opened the gate. Stacia had watched from the porch, her eyes stinging. The farm wasn't a city, it didn't have a manifesto or a council, but it was becoming a place where people could breathe, a place where life could take root without being crushed by the weight of the greater good. On the 3rd anniversary of their escape from the fire, they climbed the high ridge behind the house. The world was still a broken, dangerous place. There were still infected lurking in the dark forests. There were still men like Rowan who sought to build empires on piles of bones. But as Stacia looked down at their valley, she saw a different story. She saw the smoke curling peacefully from their chimney. She saw the emerald green of the garden and the sturdy straight lines of the fences they had built together. She saw the firewood stacked high for the coming winter and the river that provided life. She saw a future that had been earned, not stolen. Stacia leaned into Cage's side, her head on his shoulder. "We survived," she said, her voice a soft, triumphant breath. Cage turned her into his arms, his hands large and warm on her back. He kissed her temple, his beard scratching her skin in a way she had grown to love. "We did more than survive, Stacia. We rebuilt." She looked up at him, her eyes bright with a fierce, beautiful optimism. "We chose better, Cage. We chose each other." The sun dipped below the horizon, bathing the valley in a final, glorious wash of liquid gold. And for the first time since the world had ended, the silence didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a beginning. It was the quiet of a seed beneath the soil, waiting for its time to break through. They turned together and began the walk back down to the house, their hands interlaced, their shadows long and joined on the mountain path. The world was still ending, but in their small corner of the dark, the light was just beginning to grow. The end. Thanks for joining us on this journey. If enjoyed the story, please make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, check out the 2 videos showing on screen right now. You might enjoy them too.